Cijelo vrijeme zapravo se sa stožera ponavlja teza da u Hrvatskoj vlada epidemija necijepljenih.
Wir bekommen die Gefahr einer Pandemie der Ungeimpften.
Was wir im Moment erleben, ist eine Pandemie der Ungeimpften.
A pandemic of the unvaccinated.
We are seeing an outbreak of the unvaccinated.
This is an epidemic or a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
This is becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
Professor, Dr. Kulldorff, I've asked this question before, but I want to ask it again. It's important for everyone to understand what he's really saying. Is it accurate to call this pandemic and the mutations that are arising as one of the unvaccinated?
No, we shouldn't make that distinction. This is a pandemic for the whole population. In the plan, they claim that this is science-based, but that's not correct.
If you start vaccinating as we are and advocating that we have universal vaccination, what that's going to do is drive vaccine-resistant mutants. That's inevitable. That's just fundamental virology 1A. And as you do that...
Let me ask you this question, though, because the spin is just the opposite out there. It's saying that it's the unvaccinated people who are generating the mutants. Can you work through the biology of why that's exactly wrong?
Those are one of the fundamental lies, and I think it has to do with the scare tactics going on right now, because they're really all in thinking that they have to have universal vaccines. But it makes no sense to anybody that's had even basic genetics. It will evolve to escape the vaccines only in those that have been vaccinated, particularly when we have a leaky vaccine, which is what we have.
Les nouveaux variants sont vraiment la production, la résultante des vaccinations. Et donc vous voyez toujours dans les pays, même pour là maintenant c'est pareil, vous avez la courbe des vaccinations et la courbe des morts maintenant qui suit. Je suis de près, si vous voulez, des expériences qui sont faites in situ, c'est-à-dire sur des patients, des malades, qui sont devenus infectés par le corona après une vaccination. Hein? Et je veux vous montrer que ce qui est apparu, c'est un virus variant qui résiste à la vaccination.
Comment peut-on vacciner en période épidémique? Expliquez-moi.
C'est impensable. Le silence, si vous voulez, beaucoup de gens savent ça. Les épidémiologistes le savent.
New infections and deaths are rising steadily in Britain, despite 3/4 of people being fully vaccinated. Andrew Pollard had this warning to MPs.
I think we are in a situation here with this current variant where herd immunity is not a possibility because it still infects vaccinated individuals. And I suspect that what the virus will throw up next is a variant which is perhaps even better at transmitting in vaccinated populations. And so that's even more of a reason not to be making a vaccine program around herd immunity.
Associate Professor of Viral Immunology at the University of Guelph, who has been researching the COVID vaccine. Doctor, thank you for joining us in part 2 of this interview with you. Is it accurate to now call this a pandemic of the unvaccinated, or do you think those who are vaccinated could also be contributing to the emergence of these new variants?
Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me back. Absolutely, it's untrue to be calling this a pandemic of the unvaccinated. In fact, I would argue that, and it's certainly untrue, this flipping of the messaging to scare people into thinking that the unvaccinated are somehow driving the emergence of novel variants. This goes against every scientific principle that we understand. The reality is the nature of the vaccines that we are using right now and the way we are rolling them out are going to be applying the selective pressure to this virus to promote the emergence of new variants. And that's exactly what we're doing. Our vaccines are focused on a single protein of the virus. So the virus only has to alter one protein. And The vaccines don't come close to conferring sterilizing immunity.
Even in the spring in the United States, our CDC had a fully documented 10,000 cases of vaccine failures by the end of May. So we knew the vaccines were even failing before the Delta variant moved in. And in fact, the CDC gave up on this, and they started doing what's called asymmetric reporting, meaning that they were not going to count vaccine failures in the COVID-19 rates. And that's how the talking points were generated. And this is important to understand, that they were only going to report COVID-19 community cases in those that were unvaccinated, that they were no longer going to track COVID-19 in those who had received vaccination. And if they became aware, if the first test was obtained in the hospital and they were vaccinated, they would try to link it up with vaccine databases. But otherwise, the CDC is intentionally and willfully blind through breakthrough cases for COVID-19 vaccination. So that's what's created the false and fraudulent talking point that 99% of American cases are unvaccinated. It's not true. It's probably roughly 50-50. And that's what we're seeing in practice. We have about half the cases are indeed vaccine failures.
And that's what I'm hearing from my friends in ER, and obviously what we're seeing in other nations around the world, especially Israel, where that's probably the best test group to be looking at as a nation.
שלום לדוקטור קובי חביב, הוא מנכ"ל המרכז הרפואי הרצוג.
שלום סיוון.
ורק נזכור, אני מבינה שמרבית החולים מחוסנים, גם החולים הקשים.
מטבע הדברים, אנשים מבוגרים רובם מחוסנים, רוב האוכלוסייה מחוסנת, ולכן כ-90%, 85-90% מהמאושפזים אצלנו הם חולים שעברו את חיסון באופן מלא.
Aktuelle Zahlen aus Island und Israel sind durchaus alarmierend. In beiden Ländern steigen die Corona-Zahlen trotz hoher Impfquoten rasant an. In Israel erkranken auch immer mehr Geimpfte so schwer, dass sie auf die Intensivstation müssen.
In Israel herrscht Ratlosigkeit. Das Impfvorzeigeland kämpft seit einigen Wochen mit einer neuen heftigen Corona-Welle. Die positiven Fälle schießen in die Höhe. Täglich werden derzeit mehr als 3000 Fälle gemeldet. Und im Gegensatz zu Großbritannien ziehen mittlerweile auch die Krankenhauszahlen nach, sagt der israelische Journalist Gil Yaron.
Am Anfang dachte man, es gäbe so eine Entkopplung zwischen der Zahl der Neuinfizierten und der Zahl der Schwerkranken. Diese Hoffnung hat sich nicht bewahrheitet. Immer mehr Menschen, die infiziert werden, werden auch schwer krank. Und inzwischen steigt auch die Zahl der Schwerkranken exponentiell.
Mittlerweile sind knapp 63% der Israelis voll immunisiert. Besorgniserregend allerdings, der Großteil der Hospitalisierten ist über 60 Jahre alt und doppelt geimpft. Ihr Anteil liegt derzeit in Israel bei 65%, hier in Orange. Zusammen mit den Erstgeimpften sind es sogar 2/3. Der Anteil der Ungeimpften, hier in Gelb, liegt nur noch bei 29%. Jetzt steht in Israel sogar ein 4. Lockdown im Raum.
Ähnlich ist die Situation in Island. Dort sind knapp 93% der impfbaren Bevölkerung ab 16 Jahren bereits geimpft. Und dennoch erlebt Island derzeit seine bisher stärkste Corona-Welle. Mittlerweile sind mehrheitlich Geimpfte unter den Infizierten, hier in Blau zu sehen. Am vergangenen Donnerstag waren etwa von 106 neuen Fällen 71 voll immunisiert.
Clinicians have been telling me that more than half of the new COVID cases that they're seeing to treat are people who've been vaccinated.
The UK's chief scientific advisor, a man called Sir Patrick Vallance. This tape is from today.
In terms of the number of people in hospital who've been double vaccinated, we know it's around 60% of the people being admitted to hospital with COVID have been double vaccinated.
So fully 60% of patients admitted to British hospitals for severe, presumably life-threatening cases of COVID, because that's where you go to the hospital, had been fully vaccinated. That's what he just said.
Dr. Robert Malone, who's the inventor of mRNA vaccines, recently shared this link to a thread by Corona Realism. and he says, "This is worrying me quite a bit. Something really odd is going on. In Europe, we are seeing surges at many places where most of the population has already been vaccinated. At the same time, the 15 least vaccinated countries don't seem to face any problem. At some point, denying this problem will get painful. Cyprus currently has the most COVID cases per capita on Earth, yet before the most recent wave began, they had already vaccinated the majority of their adult population. The island of Malta has the highest vaccination rate in the Western world, and also currently has one of the steepest inclines in cases." Here's an article from Bloomberg, April 18th. Global COVID cases hit weekly record despite vaccinations. Here's an article in the Hindustan Times. Hungary's COVID-19 mortality rate rises despite having high vaccination rate. Here's an article from an Australian news site, May 14th. UK virus cases begin to rise despite high vaccination rate. Despite having one of the world's most successful vaccination campaigns, virus cases have begun to surge in some UK cities, worrying authorities. New York Times. Despite Chile's speedy COVID-19 vaccination drive, cases soar. The Indian Express. Despite high vaccination rate, COVID cases surge in Israel. Here's one from Reuters, June 17th. Hundreds of Indonesian doctors contract COVID-19 despite vaccination. Dozens hospitalized. India fights COVID. Worst hit, Maharashtra has administered the most number of vaccines so far.
Kada koristite naučne metode, one su objektivne I neutralne I neumoljive. Ovaj trend vrlo ubjedljivo pokazuje što više vakcinisanih, to više zaraženih.